Everyone knows how Naboo ends. Everyone knows how Naboo ends. The blade goes through the wrong Jedi. Qui-Gon Jinn falls in the Theed generator complex, run through by Darth Maul's double-bladed saber, and in the grief that follows, Obi-Wan Kenobi does something no one fully explains. He hangs from a pipe above a seemingly bottomless shaft, weaponless, his master dying on the floor above him, Darth Maul waiting, and then, in a single motion, Obi-Wan leaps, summons Qui-Gon's fallen lightsaber through the Force, and cuts Darth Maul in half. Clean, final, decisive. That's the story the saga tells. The young Padawan avenges his master. The Sith is defeated. The hero survives. But there's a version of that fight separated from the outcome by a single second, a single lapse, a single different step where the blade goes the other way, where Maul doesn't hesitate, where the Padawan falls instead of the master. Most people have never sat with that version, because the version where Obi-Wan dies in that reactor room doesn't just change a single life. It doesn't just remove one Jedi from the board. It quietly dismantles everything. The Clone Wars, the Rebellion, Anakin Skywalker's path to the dark side, Luke Skywalker's path back from it. Every critical hinge point in the next 40 years of galactic history runs, in some way, through the man who survived Naboo. Remove Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the galaxy doesn't just lose a hero, it loses the architecture of its own salvation. What happens next is not a story about one death. It's a story about what that death would have been allowed to become, and how much of the light side's eventual victory was never really about the Force at all. It was about one man being in the right place for decades, in ways no one fully mapped until it was almost too late. This is that map. Start where the grief would begin, not with Obi-Wan's body, with Qui-Gon's. In the canonical timeline, Qui-Gon dies and Obi-Wan survives to carry his master's final wish to the Council, train Anakin. The Council, reluctant, ultimately agrees, partly out of respect for a fallen knight, partly because Obi-Wan's insistence leaves them little room to refuse without seeming callous. It is Obi-Wan's grief, his determination, his raw conviction that transforms Qui-Gon's dying wish into an order. Now remove Obi-Wan. Qui-Gon's wish dies with him. There is no one left in that room on Naboo who heard it said aloud. No one with both the emotional weight and the standing to carry it to Coruscant. The Council receives a report of 2 deaths and a victory, and then, somewhere in the aftermath, they turn their eyes to a 9-year-old boy from Tatooine with no master and no advocate. The crack here isn't subtle, it's structural. Anakin Skywalker's entire path through the Jedi Order rests on a single advocate surviving long enough to argue for him. Obi-Wan, even uncertain, even young, even grieving, becomes that advocate because he made a deathbed promise and had no choice but to keep it. The Council only agrees to Anakin's training because the alternative, denying the last wish of a Jedi Knight in front of that knight's mourning Padawan, is politically untenable. If Obi-Wan dies, that calculation disappears entirely, and the Council, left to their own instincts, had already said no once. Think about that. Mace Windu, Yoda. The full Jedi Council looked at 9-year-old Anakin Skywalker, arguably the most Force-sensitive being ever recorded, and their first answer was, no, too old, too much fear, too dangerous. They needed to be overridden. They needed grief to override them. Which means, and this is the implication that starts to press on everything else, without Obi-Wan's survival, the most likely outcome is that Anakin is not trained as a Jedi at all. He goes back to Tatooine, or he's kept somewhere in the temple as a curiosity, a test subject, a problem to be studied rather than a student to be shaped. He grows up without direction, without the discipline the Order would have given him, without the friendships and the structure that, even in the canonical timeline, only barely contain the fire already burning inside him. Here is where the dread begins pressing inward from both sides at once. The canonical Anakin Skywalker becomes Darth Vader in part because of the Jedi training he received, the attachment rules, the suppression, the emotional constraints that created a pressure cooker instead of a man. That's a real critique. The Order bears real weight for what Anakin becomes. But consider the other direction. Anakin Skywalker, without any training, without any container at all, without Jedi discipline forcing the fire inward, that is not a safer outcome. That is a boy with the power to reshape matter through emotion, raised in slavery, carrying a mother he cannot protect, with no framework whatsoever for what he is or what he could become. The empire that rises from Anakin's turn in the canonical timeline is built on the ruins of a Jedi Order that, at minimum, delayed the worst of his darkness for 20 years, and produced within him enough of a self, enough of the man he'd been to ultimately choose his son over his master. In a timeline where the Order never touched him, that self may never form. And if someone else finds him first, if Palpatine locates a raw, untrained, uncontained Anakin Skywalker on Tatooine before anyone from the Order does, the shadow that rises is not Darth Vader. It is something the galaxy has no name for yet. And this is where it becomes disturbing, because Palpatine was always watching Anakin. The canonical timeline confirms that Palpatine's interest in Anakin was not incidental. It was strategic, long-planned, and deeply personal. He had already identified the boy as the key to everything before Naboo. The question in a post-Obi-Wan timeline isn't whether Palpatine finds Anakin. It's how quickly, and how completely, and with how little resistance. There is no advocate, no Jedi Master waiting in the wings, no one to intercept, delay, or complicate Palpatine's approach. In the canonical timeline, the 10-year gap between Naboo and Attack of the Clones is the period during which Obi-Wan is training Anakin inside the Order, which is also the period during which Palpatine can only influence Anakin from the outside, carefully, patiently, pretending to be a mentor and friend rather than what he actually is. He has to work around a Jedi Master. He has to be subtle. Without Obi-Wan, the subtlety is unnecessary. The next crack appears somewhere quieter, and it concerns a woman, Padme Amidala. In the canonical timeline, Padme's relationship with Obi-Wan is not romantic. It is professional, respectful, and ultimately trusting. More important, when the relationship between Padme and Anakin becomes something the Jedi Order would never sanction, Obi-Wan is the one person who knows, who is positioned to act as a check, and who, even when he doesn't intervene directly, serves as a kind of moral reference point for Anakin. The presence of his master, even as a source of guilt, shapes Anakin's choices. Now consider Padme's fate without Obi-Wan. If Anakin is never trained as a Jedi, does he ever meet Padme again? Palpatine's web reaches toward both of them. But the meeting would be different. The Anakin who walks back into Padme's life without a decade of Jedi training behind him is not the young man who has learned to mask his feelings, defer to authority, and operate within structures. He is at minimum someone rawer and less shaped. At worst, he is someone already under Palpatine's influence, approaching Padme not as a man in conflict between love and duty, but as an instrument being aimed. What happens to Padme in that version is not a story the saga ever had to tell, but the implication presses forward regardless. And that implication points toward a galaxy where the people who might have resisted what was coming are either never in position to do so, or are brought into alignment with the darkness before they realize the darkness has a name. The final crack in this section is smaller, and it concerns a conversation that almost certainly never happens. In the canonical timeline, it is Obi-Wan Kenobi who delivers Anakin and Padme's children to safety after Mustafar. It is Obi-Wan who takes Luke to Tatooine, arranges his placement with Owen and Beru Lars, watches over him from a distance for 19 years, and at the exact moment Luke is old enough and desperate enough to listen, walks back into his life and begins the chain of events that ends the Empire. Every step of that plan depends on Obi-Wan being alive to execute it. Without him, who takes Luke to Tatooine? Who watches over him? Who hands him his father's lightsaber in a hut on the edge of the Dune Sea and begins the sentence, "Your father was a great man"? If the answer is no one, then Luke Skywalker grows up on Tatooine not as a hidden hope, but as an accident waiting to be found by the wrong person first. And if the answer is someone else, then the question becomes, who? And what do they tell him? There is a shape to all of this, and it isn't what it first appears to be. The temptation, when examining what Obi-Wan's death would mean, is to frame it as a story about absence, about all the things he wouldn't do, all the battles he wouldn't fight, all the students he wouldn't train. That framing is accurate but incomplete, because what the canonical timeline actually reveals, when you map Obi-Wan's influence across 6 decades of galactic history, is not simply a list of interventions. It is a pattern of presence. Obi-Wan Kenobi is not significant because of any single action. He is significant because he was always there, or near enough to there, at every point where the light side needed one person to hold a position, ask the right question, or refuse to move. That's a different kind of importance than heroism. Heroes fight battles. What Obi-Wan does, consistently, is occupy space that the darkness cannot afford to have occupied. Consider the progression. On Naboo, he occupies the space between Anakin Skywalker and a galaxy with no one to speak for him. He doesn't train Anakin brilliantly. The prequels are explicit that the relationship is complicated, frequently difficult, and marked by failures on both sides. But he is there. And his being there means Anakin is inside the Order instead of outside it, which means when Palpatine begins his long seduction, he has to work against the grain of a decade of Jedi formation, against years of Obi-Wan's presence as a counterweight. On Geonosis, when the Republic is being maneuvered toward a war it doesn't fully understand, it is Obi-Wan who discovers the droid foundries, who transmits the intelligence that allows the Jedi to respond rather than be swept aside. Remove him, and the Clone Wars may begin. The canonical record suggests Palpatine's plan was too advanced by that point to fail entirely, but they begin differently. They begin with less Jedi forewarning. They begin with the Republic less prepared. That's not a small difference. The Clone Wars, in the canonical timeline, last 3 years. The question of whether a Republic with less preparation at the outset could have extended that timeline or collapsed it in the wrong direction is not a comfortable one. During the Clone Wars themselves, Obi-Wan is more than a general. He is in ways the films understate, and the animated series fills in one of the primary institutional voices inside the Jedi Order for caution, for questioning, for the kind of careful examination that slows momentum when momentum is being driven by someone else's agenda. He is not the only voice, but he is consistent. And consistency, inside an institution being slowly corrupted by a Sith Lord embedded at its center, has a value that exceeds any single strategic contribution. Every time Obi-Wan asks a question that doesn't get answered clearly about Sifo-Dyas, about the clone army's origins, about the unusual behavior of a particular battalion, he is, without knowing it, introducing friction into Palpatine's machinery. Not enough friction to stop it, but enough that the gears have to work harder, that the timing has to be adjusted, that the plan cannot simply proceed on autopilot. Remove him, and the machinery runs smoother. It arrives at Order 66 faster, and with fewer warning signals that anyone might have used to prepare. Here is where the hidden motive in this thought experiment crystallizes into something that feels less like speculation and more like pattern recognition. Darth Maul killing Obi-Wan Kenobi on Naboo would not simply cost the light side a warrior. It would cost the light side its most consistent source of productive friction. And productive friction, in a galaxy being slowly reshaped by a master manipulator who depends on things proceeding smoothly, is not a minor tactical variable. It is, arguably, the thing that bought the rebellion the time it needed to exist. Think about the Death Star. The original Death Star is destroyed because Luke Skywalker, flying with the Force for the first time, guided by a voice he barely knows how to hear, takes a shot that should be impossible and makes it. That moment has been analyzed 1,000 ways. But almost none of those analyses begin far enough back at the question of who taught Luke Skywalker to trust the Force in the first place. It was Obi-Wan. Specifically, it was Obi-Wan on the Millennium Falcon, an old man in the cargo hold of a smuggler's ship, putting a blast helmet on a farm boy's head and telling him to stretch out with his feelings. A lesson that lasts perhaps 10 minutes of screen time. A lesson that is apparently enough, but the lesson only works because Luke already trusts Obi-Wan. And Luke only trusts Obi-Wan because of everything that came before the stories. The lightsaber, the rescue, the relationship built over 19 years of invisible guardianship. Remove Obi-Wan from Tatooine, remove the mythology he was carefully constructing around himself and around Luke's father, and the 10 minutes in the cargo hold never happen. Even if Luke somehow makes it onto that ship, even if he somehow makes it to the Death Star, the voice he hears at the last moment is not one he recognizes. He doesn't take the shot, or he takes it wrong. And the most likely explanation for why Palpatine's plan ultimately failed, despite being sophisticated, decades long, and very nearly airtight, is that it never fully accounted for an old Jedi master spending 19 quiet years turning a farm boy into something the dark side had no category for. That's what Maul's blade, angled differently on Naboo, would have prevented. Not the hope, the preparation of the hope. The version of this story where Obi-Wan falls in the Theed generator complex doesn't announce itself as a catastrophe. That's the detail that presses hardest on everything else. It looks, at first, like a tragedy with survivors. Qui-Gon is dead, Obi-Wan is dead, but the battle is won. Naboo is free. Amidala survives. The Federation is exposed. Palpatine rises to Chancellor amid genuine celebration. By every immediate metric, the good side has prevailed. The catastrophe is the kind that takes decades to become visible. It accumulates in the gaps, in the decisions not made, the relationships not formed, the warnings not given, the positions not held. Consider the Jedi Order itself. In the canonical timeline, the Order falls in a single night. Order 66, a betrayal so sudden and total that almost no Jedi survive to understand what happened. That's the canonical outcome with Obi-Wan alive, actively suspicious, producing friction, surviving long enough to witness the full horror of what Palpatine built. In a timeline where Obi-Wan dies on Naboo, the Order falls, the structural conditions for its fall are already in place, already being constructed by Palpatine, and no single Jedi could have stopped them. But it falls into a different silence. There are fewer survivors asking the right questions afterward. The record of what happened is shaped more completely by the victors. And the victors, in this version, have less to explain away, less to conceal. Because the man who knew the most, who was there for the most, who asked questions at the most inconvenient moments, is bones in a Naboo tomb from the very beginning. The empire that rises in this version has, at minimum, a cleaner architecture. Fewer loose threads, fewer caves on desert planets, where old men are quietly transmitting information to the right, young people at the right times. What it would likely not have is a rebellion in any form resembling what the canonical timeline produces. The Rebel Alliance, in the canonical timeline, is possible because there are people, Bail Organa, Mon Mothma, Eventually, Luke and Leia, who know enough about what the Republic was and what it was supposed to be, to want it back. That knowledge doesn't emerge from nothing. It emerges from networks, from people who spoke to each other at the right times, from information that survived the purge because someone had the foresight to preserve it. Obi-Wan is part of that preservation network. More importantly, he is part of the transmission chain that eventually produces Luke, who is not simply a pilot with force sensitivity, but a specific kind of hope, shaped by a specific set of stories aimed at a specific target. In a version where Obi-Wan never reaches Tatooine, Luke Skywalker still exists. He's still Owen and Beru's nephew, still a farm boy looking at the twin suns and wanting something more. But he isn't a Jedi. He's never going to be a Jedi, because no one has told him the Jedi ever existed, or why they mattered, or that his father was one of them. He might join the rebellion anyway. He might be a talented pilot, a brave soldier, someone who matters in a smaller story about a smaller kind of resistance. But he doesn't walk into the Death Star's trench with the Force because no one has shown him the door. And without that, the Emperor's reign extends. By how long and into what is the part the thought experiment cannot fully calculate. But the implication is consistent enough to carry its own weight. Here is the final pressure point, and it concerns the dark side's internal logic. Darth Vader, canonical Vader, the man who existed in a galaxy where Obi-Wan survived Naboo, kills the Emperor in the reactor room of the second Death Star because his son is dying in front of him. That act of rescue, that final reach back toward the light, is the climax of the entire saga. It is what the whole architecture of the Force's long arc, if there is such an arc, was supposedly moving toward. But Vader's decision in that moment does not come from nowhere. It comes from 23 years of something being preserved inside him despite everything, some remnant of Anakin Skywalker that the Emperor couldn't fully extinguish. That remnant has a face. It has a voice. It speaks in a particular cadence that Vader, even at his darkest, never fully stopped hearing. It is Obi-Wan's voice. Not just because Obi-Wan trained him, but because Obi-Wan was the person, for 10 formative years, who was simply present, who believed, even imperfectly, even with friction and difficulty, that Anakin Skywalker was worth the effort. That belief leaves a mark. Not a redemptive one, not automatically. The canonical story makes clear that Obi-Wan's influence on Anakin was as much a source of resentment as comfort. But resentment at someone is still a form of connection. You can't hate a ghost if the ghost never existed. In a timeline where Obi-Wan dies on Naboo, the Anakin who eventually becomes Darth Vader, if he becomes Darth Vader at all, rather than something formed earlier and more completely under Palpatine's hand, carries a different interior landscape, different ghosts, different voices, different specific griefs. The question the thought experiment leaves hanging is not whether that Anakin could still choose the light. It's whether there would be anything left to choose with, because what Obi-Wan represents in the final accounting is not a set of skills or a list of tactical contributions. He represents continuity. He is the thread between the Republic and the Rebellion, between Anakin and his children, between the Jedi Order and Luke Skywalker's understanding of what the Jedi Order was. He is the person who remembered, and who made sure someone else would remember. Lose him on Naboo in that reactor room at age 25, before he's trained anyone or transmitted anything, or spent 19 years in a desert, making sure one specific boy grows up, knowing his father wasn't always a monster, and you don't simply lose a Jedi Knight. You cut the thread. And in a galaxy being slowly strangled by a darkness that knew exactly what it was doing, a galaxy where every instrument of hope was being methodically dismantled by a man who had planned for decades and left very few accidents in his wake. The most unsettling implication isn't what the Empire would do with more time. It's what Palpatine would have called the variable he never had to worry about. If Darth Maul's blade had simply angled half a meter to the left, the boy on Tatooine would have grown up under the same twin suns, looking at the same horizon, wanting the same impossible things, and there would have been no one, anywhere, positioned to tell him what any of it meant. He would have felt it, though the Force moves whether or not anyone explains it. And an untrained, unfound, unnamed, Force-sensitive boy in the Outer Rim, carrying a dead father's legacy and no map for it. That's not a hope waiting to be lit. That's a flame looking for the wrong kind of fuel. And somewhere in that version of the galaxy, a man in a black mask might have felt it too, and for reasons we'd rather not name, turned toward it instead of away. If you want more Star Wars truths that are rarely examined, you know where to find them. What do you think would have changed most Anakin's path? Luke's destiny, or the fate of the Force itself? Drop your answer below. Don't forget to subscribe. There are more threads in this galaxy worth pulling.